The heavy thud of the airlock sealing shut felt less like a safety measure and more like a prison sentence. Then came the hiss of pressurization, a sharp, stinging sound that signaled the end of the outside world. We were locked in. 3 months, 120 square feet. And Claire. I didn't need to look at her to know she was already organizing her station. I could hear the precise, clipped rhythm of her boots on the metal grating and the aggressive snap of a carabiner locking into place. Outside, the vacuum of space was perfectly silent. But inside, the air was already thick with static. There was absolutely nowhere to run. The research pod was a marvel of engineering, I'll give it that. Stark, white, and terrifyingly efficient. It possessed a kind of utilitarian beauty, the way a scalpel is beautiful right before it cuts you open. But beauty doesn't account for livability. The layout was an insult to personal space. 2 narrow bunks stacked like shelves in a pantry, a single hygiene unit that hummed ominously, and 1 central workstation where our elbows would inevitably collide. 0 privacy. We've been circling each other like orbital debris for 10 years. It started in grad school with a debate over load-bearing tension in low-gravity environments and spiraled into a career-defining war. I snatched the Kepler grant out from under her. She publicly eviscerated my paper on organic habitat expansion at the Geneva Symposium. She called my work reckless fantasy. I called hers soulless containment. I believe architecture should flow like a living organism, adapting to the human inside it. Claire believes architecture should dictate behavior, a rigid skeleton that forces order upon the chaos of space. We are fundamentally incompatible elements, and now we are trapped in the same test tube. That first dinner was a study in excruciating tension. We sat across from each other at the magnetic fold-out table, our knees inches apart. The only sound was the scrape of metal utensils against rehydrated food packets and the low, constant drone of the life support scrubbers. I kept my eyes on my meal, but I could feel her gaze. It felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing against my forehead. Every time I shifted, the fabric of my flight suit rustled, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet. I found myself synchronizing my chewing with hers, just to mask the noise. It was ridiculous. We are 2 of the most respected minds in our field, reduced to awkward teenagers avoiding eye contact in a cafeteria. In the quiet, details became deafening. I noticed the faint scent of the standard issue antiseptic soap, which somehow smelled different on her. Sharper, cleaner. It was intimate in a way I hadn't prepared for. Rivalry requires distance to survive. It requires podiums and lecture halls and email chains. It does not survive well when you can hear the rhythm of your enemy's lungs. The routine set in quickly, and it was its own form of torture. I had to watch her. There was nowhere else to look. I watched the specific, methodical way she tied her dark hair back every morning, her fingers moving with a dexterity that fascinated me, against my will. She didn't just tie it, she secured it, anchoring herself for the day. I watched the way she held her tablet, her thumb tracing the bezel when she was thinking, a small, nervous tick that betrayed the granite facade she presented to the world. I found myself wanting to find the flaw in the glass. I wanted to see her crack. I wanted to know if the woman who designed the most rigid structures in the galaxy had any softness in her at all. The air in the habitat recycled every 12 minutes, but the tension never cleared. It just accumulated, layer upon layer of unspoken words and professional jealousy, thickening until it felt like we were breathing liquid. I tried to focus on the biological samples we were there to monitor, but my peripheral vision was entirely occupied by the line of her throat, or the way her flight suit gathered at her waist when she reached for a switch. It was exhausting. The polite, icy silence we'd maintained for the first 48 hours was beginning to fray. I could feel the snap coming. It wasn't a matter of if, but when the pressure vessel of our politeness would finally explode. The red error message pulsing on the central monitor was the spark. But the fuel had been piling up for days, waiting for a reason to ignite. It started, as our arguments always did, with a fundamental disagreement about the nature of existence in a vacuum. We were reviewing the schematics for the Phase 2 expansion, a theoretical exercise meant to test the habitat's modular limits. I had proposed a radial design, shifting the sleep quarters outward to maximize the view of the nebula and introducing curved bulkheads to break the psychological monotony of the grid. Claire looked at it like I had suggested we build the hull out of paper mache. She didn't just reject it. She leaned over the workstation, her stylus tapping against the glass with a rhythm that set my teeth on edge. She started dismantling my work layer by layer, pointing out structural inefficiencies and load-bearing redundancies. But the habitat was too small for a purely intellectual debate. To look at the screen together, we had to stand shoulder to shoulder, our arms brushing with every gesture. The friction of the heavy, fire-retardant fabric of our flight suits created a sound that was surprisingly loud in the small space, a dry, rasping whisper of contact that made the hair on my arms stand up. I tried to focus on the data, on the stress tolerances she was highlighting, but my senses were betraying me. She was standing too close. I could smell the faint, metallic scent of the recycled air clinging to her hair, mixed with that sharp, clean soap and the heat radiating from her body. It was distracting, a sensory overload that made it hard to formulate a counter-argument about tensile strength. When she leaned across me to highlight a section of the grid, her breath ghosted against my ear, warm and quick. I stiffened, my own breathing shallowing out, trying to maintain the professional distance that our physical proximity had already destroyed. "This is reckless," she said, her voice tight. She wasn't looking at me. She was glaring at the curved wall on the screen. "You're sacrificing structural integrity for aesthetics. You're prioritizing a view over the safety margin. It's sloppy." "It's not sloppy, it's human," I snapped, the frustration finally boiling over. I turned to face her, forcing her to step back, but she didn't retreat. She held her ground, chin tilted up, eyes narrowing. "We are not machines, Claire. We can't live in a box for 3 months without going insane. You design spaces for data processors, not for people. It's soulless. It's just a cage with better ventilation." The word soulless hit her like a physical blow. Her expression hardened, the cool professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the sharp, dangerous intelligence underneath. "Safety is not soulless," she countered, her voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously quiet. "Control is not a cage. I keep people alive. You just give them a pretty place to die." We were shouting now, or close to it, our voices bouncing off the metal walls. The argument had left the blueprints behind minutes ago. This was about Geneva. This was about the grant. This was about 10 years of her looking down on me from her pedestal of perfect, rigid order. I took a step forward, intending to push past her, to get some air, but she moved with that startling efficiency, blocking my path. She backed me against the edge of the workstation, her hands gripping the edge of the desk on either side of my hips, trapping me. "You think you're the only one who cares about the mission?" she demanded, leaning in until her face was inches from mine. "You think your chaos is the only way to be brilliant?" I opened my mouth to argue, to throw another statistic or insult back at her, but the words died in my throat. Because at this distance, with the adrenaline flooding my system, I saw something that didn't match the anger in her voice. Her eyes were dark, furious, yes, but her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris. Her chest was heaving, rising and falling in a rapid, jagged rhythm that matched my own. The air between us was suddenly so thick it felt solid, charged with a static electricity that made my skin prickle. She wasn't just angry. She was exhilarated. She held me there for a heartbeat longer than necessary, her gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before snapping back up to my eyes. The silence that followed the shouting wasn't empty. It was heavy, vibrating with the sudden, terrifying realization that the energy in the room had shifted. It wasn't just rage anymore. It was something far more volatile. She pushed herself off the desk, breaking the cage of her arms, and turned back to the screen without another word. But I saw her hand tremble as she picked up the stylus. The anger hadn't dissipated. It had just transformed into a tension that pulled tight across my chest, leaving me breathless and confused in the recycled air. The habitat became a fishbowl, magnifying every movement. Outside, the vacuum was silent. Inside, the air was thick with the sound of us existing. The life support system provided the rhythm of our days, a low, constant thrum that vibrated in the floor plates and settled into my bones. It was a mechanical heartbeat, and, terrifyingly, my own pulse started to sync with it. We moved around the cramped quarters like magnets with the polarity flipped, constantly repelling, yet unable to leave the field of influence. Mornings were the most dangerous. That was when Claire exercised. She treated her body with the same rigorous discipline she applied to her blueprints. I would sit at the workstation, pretending to review the overnight telemetry, but my eyes were glued to her reflection in the dark monitor. She stripped down to a gray thermal tank top and regulation shorts, exposing skin usually hidden behind layers of heavy Nomex. I watched the sheen of sweat gather at the base of her throat, catching the harsh overhead light. I watched the corded muscle of her forearms flex as she did pull-ups on the structural beam. Her breathing settled into a heavy, rhythmic cadence that filled the small room. In, out. Every exhale was a sharp, controlled sound that seemed to echo inside my own chest. It made me painfully hyper-aware of my own physical existence. In that sterile, white environment, we were the only sources of heat and color. It was absurd. I was a senior architect with a doctorate in orbital mechanics, worrying if my professional nemesis thought I looked good in navy blue polyester. But the animosity was shifting. The sharp edges were wearing down from constant friction. It happened in the small, unintentional intimacies forced proximity demands. Handing her a coffee pouch, our fingers would brush, a grazing of skin against skin, sending a jolt through me that wasn't static electricity. She wouldn't pull away immediately. She would hold the moment a fraction of a second too long, her eyes locking onto mine, dark and unreadable, before muttering a thanks. The air in the gap between us felt charged, thick enough to taste. Then came the comments. They started professionally. She looked over my shoulder at a code sequence I was running. "That's elegant," she murmured, her voice close to my ear. "The logic loop. It's efficient. I wouldn't have routed the heat that way." Coming from Claire, that was a love sonnet. But then it got personal. I was zipping up my suit after a shower when she spoke from her bunk. "That cut suits you," she said, her voice low, almost grudging. "The newer suits usually hang wrong on the shoulders. You carry it well." I froze, hand on the zipper, feeling a flush rise up my neck that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. It was the weight of her attention that truly unraveled me. I began to catch her watching me when she thought I was absorbed in data. I'd look up to find her staring from across the room, her book forgotten in her lap. She wasn't glaring anymore. She was studying me, mapping the contours of my face as if I were a new planetary system she needed to understand. When our eyes met, she didn't look away in embarrassment or panic. She held the contact, unflinching, letting me feel the full, crushing weight of being perceived. It created a low-level electric hum in my chest, a constant state of arousal and anxiety that made it impossible to relax. We were two celestial bodies caught in a decaying orbit, spiraling closer and closer, waiting for the inevitable impact that would either destroy us or fuse us together. But if the days were a steady in tension, the nights were the hardest part of the rotation. The main lights would dim to the emergency red setting, casting the entire habitat in a submarine glow that washed out the sterility and replaced it with something intimate and dangerous. The silence would deepen, pressing against the hull, and suddenly the sound of her breathing across the room became the only real thing in the universe. I woke up at 0300 ship time, pulled from sleep not by a noise, but by the sudden, heavy absence of one. The rhythmic hum of the sleep cycle ventilation had clicked off for its nightly recalibration, leaving the habitat in a silence so profound it felt like pressure building in my ears. I lay there for a moment, staring at the underside of the bunk above me, waiting for the system to cycle back on. When it didn't immediately kick in, I swung my legs out of the bunk, the magnetic soles of my sleep socks gripping the cold plating. The main lights were down, leaving the pod bathed in the low wattage glow of the emergency strips. It washed everything in a deep crimson hue, turning the sterile white laboratory into something subterranean and strange. It felt like being inside a developing heart. I moved quietly toward the workstation to check the environmental sensors, but I stopped before I reached the console. I wasn't the only one awake. Claire was standing at the main viewport, her back to me. She had shed the heavy outer layer of her flight suit, standing now in just the form-fitting thermal undershirt and sleep shorts. It was the most exposed I had ever seen her. Not because of the skin showing, though the line of her bare legs was long and pale in the red light, but because of her posture. The rigid, military-straight spine she maintained during the day was gone. She was leaning against the bulkhead, forehead resting against the thick glass, looking out into the absolute blackness of the void. I should have gone back to bed. I should have left her to her vigil. But the pull was physical, a gravity well I couldn't escape. I walked toward her, my footsteps silent on the deck. She didn't turn, didn't jump. She knew I was there. In a box this small, you feel the displacement of air when another person moves. "The sensors are fine," she said, her voice rough with sleep and something else. Something softer than I was used to. I couldn't turn my brain off. "It's the quiet," I said, coming to stand beside her, careful to leave a foot of space between us. "It gets loud in here when the fans stop." She nodded, her eyes still fixed on the starfield. "It's not the quiet, it's the chaos out there. You look at it and you see wonder. I look at it and I see a hostile environment trying to crush us into dust." She traced a finger against the glass, drawing a line between two distant stars. "That's why I build the way I do. Rigid, redundant. I build cages because cages keep the monsters out. I need to know that the walls will hold." It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked need for control. "I don't see monsters," I said softly. "I see a current. You can't fight the ocean, Claire. You have to move with it. If you build a wall too rigid, the wave shatters it. But if you build something that can flex, that can breathe, it survives." I waited for the rebuttal. I waited for her to snap, to quote a safety regulation, to tell me I was being poetic and reckless. But she didn't speak. She turned her head slowly, pulling her gaze away from the terrifying vastness of space to look at me. In the red light, her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris until her eyes were just pools of dark ink. She stopped arguing. She didn't bring up the tensile strength data. She didn't roll her eyes. She just watched me. Her gaze dropped from my eyes to my mouth, then lower to the hollow of my throat. She was studying me with an intensity that made my skin burn, tracking the rhythm of my respiration. I realized then that she wasn't looking for a structural flaw. She was watching me breathe. The air between us thickened, heavy and charged. The silence stretched, no longer empty, but filled with a deafening volume of everything we weren't saying. I could feel the heat radiating from her arm, inches from mine. The rivalry, the academic debates, the years of friction. It all evaporated in the dark, leaving only this: two women in a tin can, circling a truth neither of us dared to name. She shifted, turning her body fully toward me. Her hand lifted, hovering in the space between us, fingers trembling slightly, as if she wanted to reach out and trace the line of my jaw, to confirm that I was real and solid, and there. My breath hitched, a sharp, audible intake of air that betrayed me completely. The moment hung suspended, fragile as glass. We were on the precipice of something irreversible. Her lips parted, a breath of a word forming there. But before she could speak, the console behind us screamed. The alarm didn't just break the silence, it obliterated the world. 1 second we were suspended in a delicate, terrifying gravity of potential touch, and the next, the console behind us was screaming the shrill, ascending wail of a Class 1 atmospheric breach. The red emergency lighting, which had been a soft, intimate glow, began to strobe violently, turning the habitat into a disorienting flicker book of terror. Instinct took over. The softness in Claire's eyes vanished, replaced instantly by the hard, crystalline focus of survival. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. We moved in perfect, practiced synchronization, abandoning the window and sprinting for the EVA lockers. The air was already changing, getting thinner, colder. I could hear the hiss of escaping gas, a deadly sibilance cutting through the claxons. It was the sound of the void trying to get in. My hands, usually steady with a soldering iron, fumbled with the magnetic clasps of my suit. The thick, fire-retardant fabric felt clumsy and heavy after the vulnerability of the last few minutes. I shoved my legs into the rigid lower assembly, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. But the terror that gripped me wasn't for myself. I looked over at Claire, struggling with her helmet seal, her face pale and set in a grimace of concentration. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. If I lose her, the silence won't just be quiet. It will be absolute. "Seal check," she barked over the growing roar of the wind, her voice tight. I stepped toward her, my gloved hands grabbing the locking ring of her helmet. This wasn't the tentative, trembling reach of a lover. This was the desperate, forceful grip of survival. I twisted the mechanism until it clicked, checking the green pressure indicator at her throat. She did the same for me, her hands moving over my suit with trembling precision, checking my latches, patting down the seals on my chest and ribs. Through the thick layers of the suit, I could still feel the phantom pressure of her touch. It was forced intimacy, aggressive and necessary. "Breach is in the secondary coupling," I shouted over the comms as the audio dampeners kicked in. "We have to manually override the valve in the maintenance crawl space." The crawl space was a coffin-sized tube running beneath the floor plates. It wasn't designed for 2 people in full EVA gear, but the override required dual-key activation. We jammed ourselves into the narrow metal throat of the ship, bodies pressed together from shoulder to knee. The physical claustrophobia was suffocating. My helmet visor scraped against hers with a jarring clack. "I can't reach the leverage point," Claire gasped. Her voice was right in my ear, amplified by the helmet comms. It was intimate in a disturbing, visceral way. I could hear every hitch in her breath, every swallow, the ragged, shallow panting of panic rising in her throat. The iron architect was hyperventilating. "Claire," I said, pitching my voice low and steady, channeling every ounce of confidence I had left. "Look at me." She turned her head, her eyes wide and terrified behind the polycarbonate glass. We were inches apart, separated only by 2 layers of transparent daring. "Breathe with me," I commanded. "In, out. You are the most brilliant engineer I know. This is just plumbing. We are going to fix it." I saw her throat work as she swallowed. She locked eyes with me, anchoring herself to my calm. Slowly, the frantic rhythm of her breathing slowed, matching the cadence of my voice. She nodded, a small, jerky movement. "Okay," she whispered, the sound wet and shaky in my ear. "Okay, on 3. We reached for the manual wheel together, our gloved hands overlapping. We heaved against the pressure. The metal groaned, protesting. And then, with a shudder that vibrated through our bodies, the valve turned. The hissing stopped. The klaxons cut out, leaving only the sound of our ragged breathing filling the sudden, stunning silence of the comms loop. We were alive. We were tangled together in the dark, sweating and shaking, but the air was holding fast. We stumbled back into the main habitat, the transition from the crawl space jarring and sudden. The red emergency lights had finally ceased their strobe, replaced by the stark, clinical white of standard operations. But the world still felt tilted on its axis. We stripped off the EVA gear with frantic, clumsy haste. The heavy thud of polycarbonate boots hitting the deck, the sharp hiss of the neck seals disengaging. It was a cacophony of shedding armor. When the final layer of the heavy suit peeled away, the sudden weightlessness was dizzying. I stood there in my damp thermal liners, shivering not from the ambient cold, but from the sudden, violent crash of adrenaline leaving my system. I looked at Claire. She was leaning heavily against the lockers, her chest heaving, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Her hands were shaking. Not a little tremor, but violent, uncontrollable shivers that rattled the metal clips on her discarded suit. She looked down at them as if they belonged to someone else, a deep frown of confusion creasing her brow. She was trying to force them still, trying to command her body with the same rigid authority she used on her blueprints. But her biology wasn't listening. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. I stepped closer, reaching out to cover her trembling hands with my own. My skin was hot, damp, and alive. "It's just the crash. It's normal. The adrenaline is dumping." She didn't pull away. For the first time in 10 years, she didn't recoil from my touch or stiffen with professional indignation. Instead, she turned her hands over, gripping my fingers with a strength that bordered on painful. She held on like I was the only structural beam left in a collapsing building. She looked up, and the raw, unguarded terror in her eyes knocked the wind out of me. "I wasn't scared of the vacuum," she whispered, her voice cracking on the last syllable. It was a confession that seemed to tear itself out of her throat. "I know the vacuum. I know the math of decompression. I know exactly how long it takes to lose consciousness. That's just physics." She took a jagged breath, stepping closer until our toes bumped. I was terrified of the silence. I was terrified that the comms would cut out, and I would be the only thing left making a sound in this entire, God-forsaken universe. The admission hung in the air, heavy and absolute. This wasn't the Iron Architect speaking. This was the woman who stood at the window at 3 a.m. because she couldn't turn her brain off. "You are never going to be alone," I said, squeezing her hands, grounding her. I wasn't going anywhere. "You don't get it," she shook her head, a strand of loose hair falling into her eyes. She didn't brush it away. "I've spent 10 years fighting you. 10 years tearing apart your theories, attacking your methodology, pushing you to prove me wrong." She looked at me, really looked at me, with a devastating clarity. "I didn't do it because I hated your work. I did it because you were the only one who pushed back. You were the only one who made me check my math. You were the only variable I couldn't control. And God, I loved that you couldn't be controlled. My heart hammered against my ribs, a different rhythm than the fear from before. It was a heavy, dull ache of realization. I didn't fight you for the grants, Claire, I admitted, my voice dropping to a murmur. The space between us had vanished. We were breathing the same recycled air, sharing the same small pocket of heat. I fought you because I wanted your respect. I wanted you to look at me. I figured if I couldn't have your approval, I'd take your attention, even if it was angry, even if it was a war. Her grip on my hands shifted, sliding up my wrists, her thumbs pressing into the pulse points there. She could feel it, the frantic, betraying cadence of my blood. The professional rivalry, the grants, the symposiums, the arguments, it all dissolved, revealing the foundation that had been there all along. It wasn't hate. It was obsession. It was a decade of sublimated desire wrapped in the safety of academic debate. Claire didn't move away. She stood her ground, her body radiating heat, her eyes dropping from my gaze to my lips. The invitation was unspoken, but it was deafening. She didn't rush. That was the most terrifying part. For a woman who lived her life by the strict governance of countdown clocks and orbital windows, she moved now with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. She stepped into the small remaining space between us, closing the gap until the heat radiating from her body felt like a physical force field pushing against my own. The air in the habitat, usually so sterile and controlled, suddenly felt thick, heavy with the scent of adrenaline that was slowly fading into something muskier, something deeper, the smell of skin and sweat and the ozone tang of the airlock. Her hand came up, not with the sharp, pointing accusation I had known for a decade, but with a tentative grace that made my breath catch in my throat. Her palm was warm, damp, and calloused from years of handling raw materials and tools. When she cupped my jaw, her thumb settled on the line of my cheekbone, tracing the bone structure with the same reverence she usually reserved for a perfect structural weld. She was mapping me. She was learning the topography of the enemy she had been circling for 10 years, testing the defenses, looking for the point of entry. Her gaze held mine, unflinching, stripping away the last layers of professional armor I had left. I didn't breathe. I couldn't. I just watched her eyes, dark and unfathomable, searching mine for a sign of retreat. Finding none, she leaned in. The first kiss was a question. It was a soft, barely there brush of lips, a static shock that jumped the gap between two charged capacitors. It was an inquiry into the physics of us. Is this stable? Will this hold? It was tentative, terrified, and impossibly sweet. Then I made a sound, a low, involuntary noise in the back of my throat that vibrated against her mouth. And the question was answered. The hesitation shattered. Claire made a noise that sounded like a sob and a growl intertwined, and she surged forward, eliminating the concept of personal space entirely. This wasn't the polite, cinematic romance of earthbound lovers. This was desperate. This was 3 years of professional restraint snapping like an overloaded cable. The kiss deepened, becoming a consuming force. It was sultry and overwhelming, a tidal wave of sensation that drowned out the hum of the scrubbers and the blinking lights of the console. I tasted the salt on her lips, the metallic tang of fear that we had both just swallowed, and the overwhelming, intoxicating warmth of her breath. She kissed with the same intensity she brought to everything, focused, precise, and demanding. She explored the curve of my lip, the seam of my mouth, with a cadence that was slow and heavy, savoring the friction, the wet heat, the undeniable reality of contact. It was a thorough dismantling of boundaries, a complex algorithm of desire finally resolving into a simple, undeniable truth. Her hands moved from my face to tangle in my damp hair, her fingers tightening against my scalp, pulling me closer until there was absolutely no air left between us. I gripped her waist, my fingers digging into the soft fabric of her thermal liner, finding the solid, muscular warmth of her waist beneath. In the low gravity of the station, where up and down were merely suggestions, she became my only anchor. The floor plates didn't matter, the walls didn't matter. The only gravity that existed was the pull of her body against mine, the firm, unyielding pressure of her hips pressing me back against the lockers. We stood there, locked together in a tangle of limbs and thermal fabric, trying to consume a decade of lost time in a single moment. The rivalry, the arguments, the petty disputes over schematics, they all incinerated in the heat of this proximity. It was a sultry confirmation of everything the silence had promised. We weren't enemies. We were two halves of the same high-pressure system, finally equalizing. When we finally broke apart, it was only because the biological imperative to breathe became impossible to ignore. We didn't go far. We pulled back just enough to gasp for air, our foreheads resting together, a bridge between our minds. Her eyes were closed, her lashes dark against her pale cheeks, and I could feel the rapid, fluttery beat of her pulse where her neck pressed against my hand. "Okay," she whispered, the word ghosting across my wet lips. "Okay." "Yeah," I breathed back, my voice wrecked. "Okay." We stayed like that for a long time, anchored in the aftermath, realizing that the war was over. We hadn't just survived the vacuum. We had survived the truth. The mission parameters remained static, yet the atmosphere inside the habitat underwent a complete, irreversible phase shift. The final 6 weeks weren't a countdown to extraction anymore. They were a blur of productivity and proximity, a seamless integration of our professional minds and our personal desires. The rivalry didn't vanish, but it transmuted into something playful, a game we played to keep our intellects sharp while our bodies remained constantly, magnetically connected. We would stand at the main console for hours, running complex simulations on the Phase 2 expansion. But now, the rigid distance was gone. Claire would stand behind me, her arms wrapped securely around my waist, her chin resting on my shoulder as she critiqued my load-bearing calculations. "You're still favoring the aesthetic curve," she would murmur, against the sensitive skin of my neck, her breath warm and distracting. "But the math holds. Barely." I would lean back into her, feeling the solid, grounding warmth of her chest against my back, the contact creating a static charge that had nothing to do with the equipment. I could feel her smile against my skin. "The math is perfect," I'd counter, turning my head to steal a lingering kiss that tasted of coffee and certainty. "You just hate that it's pretty." Meals ceased to be silent, excruciating exercises in avoidance. They became the intimate center of our day. We sat on the floor, ignoring the folding table entirely, our knees knocking together as we shared pouches of rehydrated stew. We debated the merits of brutalism versus organicism until we were laughing too hard to eat. I learned that Claire, the iron architect, possessed a laugh that started deep in her belly and shook her whole frame. A rich, human sound that finally made these sterile white walls feel like a home. The nights, however, were the most profound change. The narrow bunks, designed for solitary confinement, became our shared sanctuary. We slept entangled, a complex knot of limbs and soft gray thermal fabric. Waking up became the best part of the rotation. I would drift into consciousness to the steady, rhythmic sound of her heartbeat against my ear, the weight of her arm heavy and protective across my waist. In the dim morning light, I would trace the line of her spine through her shirt, marveling at the fact that this formidable, brilliant woman had carved out space for me in her rigid orbit. It was a domesticity I hadn't thought possible in zero-G. The simple, profound comfort of her breath syncing with mine in the dark. The way she would subconsciously pull me closer before she even opened her eyes. Yet, as we packed the final biological sample containers, a new tension crept in. The fear of re-entry. Not the physical danger of the atmosphere, but the emotional danger of the real world. Here, in our suspended bubble, we made sense. But down there were department heads, grant committees, and a decade of public rivalry waiting to separate us. I finally voiced it. Will this survive gravity? I asked, staring at a sealed vial. Or is this just a vacuum adaptation? Claire stopped sealing a crate. She crossed the room with purpose, took the container from my hands, and set it down. The data is solid, she said, her voice dropping into that serious, confident register that always steadied me. We built a foundation here. It's not theoretical anymore. It's structural. She kissed me then, slow and reassuring, sealing the promise. I don't abandon a project once the blueprint is done. We're building this. On Earth. The airlock cycled open for the extraction team, flooding the habitat with the harsh hiss of terrestrial pressure. We stood on the platform, bags packed with 3 months of data and a lifetime of change. I looked at the stars one last time, then at Claire. She wasn't looking at the void. She was looking at me, her hand finding mine and squeezing tight. Ready? She asked. Ready, I said. The stars were beautiful, but the view right here was better. If you want to see what we build next, subscribe.